When I first started using Kahoot, I had issues with the image. There were two main problems. One, Kahoot automatically resized the image to be of a dimension that I didn't quite like. The other problem was clarity. So I looked to find an answer, to find the ideal height and width for these images, and I couldn't find it. Kahoot does give you the maximum resolution. You can have a maximum height or a maximum width of 3,264. But they didn't have a great answer for the aspect ratio. One thing, after inquiring, they did said to try to have it match your screen resolution. So I tried this, and I still found that Kahoot managed to warp the image to some degree. So I ended up doing some measurements, and what we have here on this Excel spreadsheet is those measurements. I took different measurements based on an aspect ratio of 16:9. So over here we have different screen sizes ranging from 640 to 360 to 17,280 to 9720. Right? So each of these had a 16:9 width to height ratio. And for each one, Kahoot continued to change the actual image that it displayed. So it went from having an aspect ratio of 2.64 to basically 1.8. So this never quite reached that ideal 16:9 ratio that they recommended. And I graphed this. Here you see that it starts at that 2.46 range, and as your screen gets larger and larger, it approaches asymptotically that 1.7777. But it never gets there. And so most of us don't have an infinitely large screen. Our screen is much smaller. For example, my screen is just about this size, 1920 by 1080. And so it's going, if I do 1.778, it's going to change the size to some degree. The aspect ratio is going to be much different. So I'd want to, instead of using that 1.778, use something that's going to match the exact screen that I'm going to be displaying the Kahoot on. Now that screen might not be the screen that you're working from in creating the Kahoot. So if you're working on your laptop, but you're displaying it in your classroom using a larger television, then you'd want to match the resolution on that television. Over here on the right, I did the same thing, except with an aspect ratio of 4/3. And we found the same result, that the actual measured result got closer and closer to this width over height, but it never quite got there. So next, what do I do with that data? So ideal sizes. So we could use this width and the height, as we found out here, or finding something close to it. So if we had some screen that was 1600 for our width, then we could use something in the middle between these 2 points, right? Something between 768 and 1152. Shooting for a width to height ratio of maybe about 2.0. So it depends, again, what our aspect ratio is. But the other significant part is maximizing the resolution. So the max resolution is 3,264. Now, there might be some good reasons to do that. You'll have the clearest image possible. But there's also some things that aren't beneficial from doing that. For example, bigger images take up more space. They take more time to load. The computer will find it harder to process these. So as you experience this, as you get used to working with these images, you might find that you might not want to have a max resolution image all the time. But you'll have to play around and experiment. So here are the results of my findings. For whatever screen size you have over here, this is the ideal ratio you want. And if you want to maximize the resolution, you want to have a width that's 3,264 and a height that corresponds based on this column. Okay, if you don't see your screen size here, just take the ideal ratio that's closest to it and feel free to do an average. Like we mentioned before, if you had a width of 1600, then something between these two. If you had a width of something about 2500, 2789, then take the average of these two. And it's going to be the same thing if you have aspect ratio of 4/3. So I also looked at how much of an error I would get, how much of a difference the ideal ratio would be versus the actual ratio that I got. And so it did give significant differences. If you have a very small screen, you're going to get a 40% difference. But as you get much, much larger, you'll only get something like a 1% difference. So for me, being in this area, I'm getting between a 10 and a 15% error. And I found that to be significant. I'm not using the screen to its maximum potential. And for that reason, I chose to use more exact ratios, the ratio that truly corresponds to the screen size that I'm using.